The poem of Beowulf was something I was entirely unfamiliar with until about a month ago, when, as part of a mission to become more well-read, I decided to dive into the epics of world history. I had absolutely no idea what I was getting myself into, and rather quickly became lost in the complicated history and heavy themes imbued into this piece of Anglo-Saxon literature. Yet, after reading through 3 different translations and accompanying commentary, as well as an essay and several videos explaining the matter, I at least hope I have a comprehensive enough understanding to explain it in a cohesive manner. However, before I do that, we must first understand the language in which it's written. Although heavily debated by scholars, Beowulf is believed to have been first written down sometime between the 8th and 11th century in Anglo-Saxon England. What this means is that while the poem is still technically in English, it's not in any form understandable by modern speakers, as the language became heavily Latinized after William's conquest in 1066, something you should already know if you've seen Oversimplified. This language, called Old English or Anglo-Saxon, is much closer in resemblance to European languages such as Dutch, Danish, or German than anything spoken in modern Britain. What this inevitably means is that unless one is fluent in Old English, which I am certainly not, any reading of this poem must by necessity be a translation, meaning that particular care must be taken to ensure you're consuming an accurate copy. So please do your research before buying. However, when one gets past this quite harsh language divide, what's discovered is one of the most studied pieces of English literature in world history, and by far the most foundational text for modern fantasy, thanks primarily to the fascination of its founders. It's an over 1,000-year-old poem teeming with a culture that wants to find the life of Northern Europe, displaying the conflict between Christianity and the pagan past while girdled by a subtle court political drama and hinting at the folktale elements far older than the narrative itself. However, amongst this rich storytelling is an even richer academic history that, if not properly understood, will leave the poem underappreciated. As I previously stated, Beowulf is believed to have been written down sometime between the 8th and 11th century. However, the narrative itself takes place during the 6th century, primarily in the modern-day nations of Sweden and Denmark. Although it's first and foremost a literary work, the epic still provides valuable insights into the lives of Northern Germanic people in the early medieval period. As Simon Schama writes in his series on the history of Britain, although the great Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf is an epic fantasy of a monster-slaying hero, its vision of churls, free warriors, feasting in the great timbered hall of their ring-giver lord could not have been far from the truth. It's due to this possibility of insight that although the poem was housed in the Cotton Library, alongside literary works such as Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, it was never revered as such, instead being studied first and foremost as a historical document, frustrating scholars due to the many fantastical elements inserted to the text. It wasn't until a lecture by Professor J.R.R. Tolkien in 1936, titled Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, that the text would gain widespread recognition as a piece of literature. All of this should be kept in mind to fully understand and appreciate the poem's impact on English literature. However, what's far more important is understanding the narrative itself and the history which surrounds it. The epic begins with a mythical account of Shield Chafing, a legendary figure said to have arrived on the shores of Denmark naked and alone, yet grew from a helpless child to unite the Danes and found the royal dynasty of the Shieldings, depriving his enemies of their mead benches and receiving tribute from surrounding tribes, asserting that he was never stingy with his wealth, giving out lavish gifts to all who deserved, and upon his death, being loaded upon a ship with hoards of treasure sent back to the sea from which he came. Accounts of mythical figures arriving alone from the sea are not uncommon in North Germanic myths, often evoking feelings of divine intervention or semi-divine status, something Tolkien would later emulate with the Istari in Middle-earth, with Gandalf, Saruman, and the like arriving on ships from the west to aid the free peoples. The generosity of Shield is also notable, as the practice of gift-giving was incredibly important in a society that existed prior to feudalism or a centralized currency. By my understanding, many of these cultures operated on a shared system of goodwill, in which individuals were naturally expected to perform reasonable tasks for friends or social superiors, receiving gifts or services in return. Meaning that a king or nobleman who is stingy will rather quickly have peers and subordinates turn against them. Hence the necessity for shield chafing to always be open-handed, and thus being praised for it. Lastly, the burial is of note, as this is something that absolutely occurred in Northern Europe, and would be emulated in modern literature, such as the death of Boromir in The Lord of the Rings, or the burial rite of House Tully in A Song of Ice and Fire. However, the key differences from these examples and that which occurred in history is that in sites such as Sutton Hoo near Suffolk, England, the ship itself was buried within the earth, a contradiction answered by Tom Shippey with the poetic motif of Shield returning to the sea, and the necessity to explain why this legendary figure has no known grave. From this point on, we continue down Shield's line of succession, hearing of Beyo or Barley, followed by Helftina, and eventually Hrothgar, who, after winning many battles and bringing greater wealth to his people, orders the construction of Heorot, a great timbered hall said to be so beautiful and vast that none like it stood on this Middle Earth. Yet the loud merriments produced reached so far across the land, it came to the ears of Grendel, a grim and dark creature inhabiting the marshlands, who grew deathly jealous of the joy. As night fell and the shieldings lay sleeping in the hall, he attacked, snatching 30 thanes from their beds and devouring them tooth and nail. It's within this conflict between Hrothgar's courts and the monster Grendel that the first half of this poem exists, a setting that is quite notable in regards to its history, as the semi-legendary figure of King Hrothgar in the Hall of Heorot appears to have had a place in the collective consciousness of Northern Europe, with Tolkien writing that it should be seen in the same vein as an English author setting their conflict in Camelot under King Arthur. It's also here where the first Judeo-Christian elements expressly appear in the text, as Grendel is named a descendant of Cain, a figure who in the biblical canon is said to have committed the first murder of his brother Abel, and in this narrative is the father from which all unnatural creatures sprang. Simultaneously, it should be kept closely in mind that while this narrative was most certainly written by a Christian author, it's set in pre-Christian Scandinavia and involves expressly pagan figures. The author solves this problem for himself and his Christian audience by painting our main characters as intuitive monotheists, carefully carving out any direct reference to the Christian God, yet still having the figures refer to a singular deity. Further exemplified in the backsliding the author characterizes, describing how after years of Grendel's torment, the shieldings turn to idol worship in desperation. It's during the many years of Hrothgar's plight, a period in which Heorot is abandoned on a nightly basis, that the story first reaches the ears of Beowulf, Thane and nephew of King Helak of the Eights, a historically distinct people once inhabiting modern-day Sweden. In response to the news, Beowulf collects some of the most notable warriors he can find, and after consulting his counselor, set sail for Denmark to slay the beast. Now, before we handle Beowulf's arrival in Heorot, we must first take a look at the character himself, and more specifically his name, as unlike most featured in this epic, Beowulf is quite unique in North Germanic culture, with many scholars believing the name to link back to a bear's son tale, highlighting some of the much older elements that make up this millennia-old narrative. For those unfamiliar, the Bear's Son tale is a frame which follows a story of a boy who was either raised by or descended from bears, possessing massive strength and using it to fight some kind of inhuman monster. Already, these core aspects share incredible similarities with Beowulf, as he's described to be the strongest of his people, and as we can infer, plans to utilize it against Grendel. Many more similarities appear as one looks deeper into the common elements these stories share. Similarities that led to academics such as Tolkien to attempt a reconstruction of the folktale with the Selich spell. And speaking of Tolkien, the more keen of you may have already guessed that it's this common tale which inspired the character of Beorn featured in The Hobbit. As Beowulf and the Yates set down in Denmark, they're quickly confronted by a watchman of the coast, who, after discerning the men are of good intention, sets guard to watch the ship and shows the way to Heorot. Upon their arrival, Beowulf and his men are approached by Wulfgar, a herald of the king, and questioned of their intentions in a manner not dissimilar to that of Aragorn, Gimli, and the like in Edoras. Beowulf, for the first time, gives his name, and reveals that he is not only one of Hilak's Thanes, but a table companion, a position of high authority and personal counsel in northern culture. Understanding this, Wulfgar grants them entry, and announces their presence to the king, with the poet stressing that he does so in the proper court manners, not shouting from across the hall, but approaching the king respectfully. In the midst of hearing his name and intentions, Hrothgar announces that he actually met Beowulf as a boy, and that his father Ectheo once sought refuge in his court after being unable to afford the weregild or blood money required to settle a feud after slaying a Yadish prince, a price which Hrothgar in his generosity paid in return for an oath of allegiance, establishing existing good relations between the families. He declares that Beowulf's arrival must be some kind of divine intervention, having heard tales of his massive strength. Yet still skeptical of his commitment, he welcomes him to take a seat and further consider the situation. The largest thing of note here is the reference to the vicious blood feuds that characterized Northern Europe for hundreds of years, in which a conflict would begin with the slaying of a family member, only to trigger a cycle of avenging deaths for countless generations. Now, this phenomena was not limited exclusively to Scandinavia. However, the practice continued much longer in this region due to the late Christianization, meaning it lacked a central church authority to handle such matters. Disputes were often prevented or settled with the paying of weregild by the offending party, often scaled in price based on the status of the victim. However, given that it's humans we're dealing with, this money was often not enough to fill the hole left by those taken, inevitably triggering the feud once more. This is what makes a character such as Hrothgar so important, as he not only paid the weregild on behalf of Beowulf's father, but the strength of his kingdom ensured that the agreement would be upheld, something that should be kept in mind as we continue. A more minor aspect is the poet's reference to court manners, displaying the apparent audience for this epic, as it's clearly intended for the aristocracy, one of the few classes who could actually read during this period, and a fact that should always be kept in mind when analyzing pre-modern literature. While sitting with his men and enjoying the hospitality of Hrothgar, Unferth, a counselor of the king, having grown jealous of Beowulf's confidence, loudly inquires if he is the same Beowulf who once lost a swimming contest to his childhood friend Breca. Asking if he could not deliver on that boast, why even bother with Grendel? Beowulf responds, declaring that perhaps Unferth has drunk too much beer, because it was in fact he who won the contest, telling of how they swam out together to the sea, and though he was the stronger swimmer, never left his friend behind for 5 nights, eventually being separated in a great storm where he was attacked by many monsters, slaying several before washing up on the shores of Finland, declaring that he does not wish to boast of it, much like how Unferth does not wish to boast responsibility for the death of his kin, asking why, if he was such a mighty warrior, Grendel was allowed to terrorize Heorot for 12 years. As Beowulf says this, he reaffirms his commitment to do what Unferth couldn't, and slay the beast once and for all. This is the first of many cutaways that occurs throughout this epic, often serving some kind of core purpose in providing context or foreshadowing future events. In this instance, what we are witnessing is likely a form of flighting, a formalized insult match which often involves misconstruing previous events to make the opponent appear worse than reality. We see this quite clearly with Unferth's removal of context to the swimming match, something that was in reality quite notable for Beowulf, openly displaying his prowess in combat. But what we don't see is Unferth's context for kinslaying, an incredibly serious accusation in virtually any society, and especially North Germanic. However, it's quite obvious that Unferth is not simply a murderer, or he would not hold the political position he does. What likely occurred is a conflict of allegiance that stands as an ever-common motif in this culture's literature, where individuals are forced to choose between oaths to a king and relations of blood, with those who stay true to their kings being seen as the most noble men alive, a category which Unferth likely falls in, though it is never revealed to us, as the poet seems to hold some kind of personal dislike for the character. In response to Beowulf's declaration, Hrothgar takes heart in the young man, believing that he will truly uphold his promise, and great feasting occurs, during which Hrothgar's king Wealhtheow greets the men of Jætland, offering Beowulf a ceremonial mead cup in welcome while thanking God for sending a strong warrior to help. In response, Beowulf gives a short speech reaffirming his commitment. Wealhtheow is an interesting figure, as she is one of only 3 female characters in the entire poem, serving the purpose here of the welcoming face and gracious host that the queen's role often was in these societies, though displaying a breadth of political acumen as well, as her kind words clearly goaded Beowulf into making a sacred vow over a cup of mead, something very serious in the historical context. The celebrations continue until Hrothgar deems it time to retire, leaving Heorot in Beowulf's keeping, something he declares to have never done until this moment. With this, the Yeats and his men are left on giant watch to defend Heorot or die trying. As they prepare for bed, Beowulf strips himself of gear, having made a promise to fight the beast in hand-to-hand combat, before laying down with the others, yet being the only one to remain awake. Then, out of the night, Grendel approaches. Finding the doors heavily reinforced, he easily rips them apart, entering Heorot to feast. He first grabs an anonymous Yiddish warrior, tearing him apart and drinking his blood before any can react, while Beowulf, pretending to sleep, watches in preparation. As Grendel moves in, he lunges at the monster, gripping firmly on the beast's arm. Suddenly, in a panic, Grendel wildly flails around the hall, attempting to loosen the Yeats' grip, while other warriors hack at him with swords and axes, to no avail. The poet describes how the mighty hall of Heorot shook violently from the battle, before in desperation, Grendel fled through the very doors he ripped open, though so violently his arm tore from its sinews, and was ripped off in the process, leaving him to flee in the wilderness, dying of his injuries. The scene of Beowulf wrestling with Grendel in the Hall of Heorot stands as one of the most iconic in the entire poem, and serves as the first of 3 great battles Beowulf engages in. An important aspect of note here is the fact that traditional weapons were ineffective against the monster, offering an explanation to the reader for why it was necessary to wrestle, existing on top of the already honorable promise Beowulf made against weaponry earlier in the poem, all existing as a possible explanation to an aristocratic audience, an audience that deeply values weapons as family heirlooms. Simultaneously, there's references to God granting Beowulf his victory, and hell opening up to receive Grendel's heathen soul, drawing parallels in the mind of a Christian reader between the downfall of Grendel and the biblical flood that wiped out his race. The following morning, great celebration occurs, as the victory is discovered, and the court poet praises Beowulf by implicitly comparing him with the hero Sigismund, known for plundering a dragon horde and bringing great wealth to his people. while simultaneously reflecting on the rise and fall of Heremod, a king we can assume through the story's contemporaries rose to power sometime prior to shield chafing, yet fell from grace due to hoarding of his wealth and brutally suppressing potential equals. In the midst of these festivities, Hrothgar is pictured admiring the torn arm of Grendel, and delivers a speech thanking God for sending Beowulf his way, declaring that he will love the eight as a son. The tale of Sigismund is a notable one, as its subtle foreshadowing for the final act of the poem, yet also serves to show just how impactful Beowulf is, equivalent in status to a Greek warrior compared to Heracles or Perseus, while the reminiscence on Heremod is very clearly a warning to our main character, as Beowulf after killing Grendel will gain newfound status and wealth, requiring care not to fall to the temptation of greed. However, by far the most important moment in this celebration was Hrothgar's declaration that he will love Beowulf as a son, carrying the connotation that he will adopt him, naming him the preferred successor to the Danish throne. Something which makes sense when you remember the necessity of a strong leader to prevent blood feuds reawakening or a succession crisis occurring. A crisis the poet later hints at with the first mention of Hrothulf, a brother of Hrothgar and incredibly powerful figure in Denmark, all while the court poet tells stories of previous battles with the neighboring Jutes and Frisians, putting on display existing tensions that could explode when Hrothgar passes. Well, Theo, understanding the meaning of Hrothgar's speech, immediately encourages him to leave the kingdom to his kin, and instead greatly reward Beowulf for his valor, believing that her people are united and the Yates could make a valuable ally if a succession crisis occurs. All of this interwoven with numerous references to future events, the death of Hrothgar, Helak, and eventual burning of Heorot. With this newfound status, Beowulf must now navigate a tense political situation in the court, showing humility when possible and planning his next course of action, whilst Wealhtheow gifts lavish items not only as a thank you for Grendel, but in an attempt to win support for her son's claim. However, before the dust can even settle on Beowulf's victory, a new threat rears its head. From the nearby marshes where Grendel once resided, the being which had begotten that very fiend emerges to claim vengeance. Grendel's mother comes to Heorot, and though less terrible than Grendel himself, still manages to kill and steal the body of Aesir, the most beloved thane and dear counselor to the king. Beowulf, having slept in separate guest lodgings, awakes from a good night's rest to discover the tragedy. Hrothgar is distraught, questioning if he will ever be freed from this curse, and beginning to fall back from his monotheistic piety, though Beowulf assures him that vengeance is better than mourning, and that once again he shall slay this new monster, or die in the attempt. It's quite obvious that the standout figure in this section is Grendel's mother, being the second of three female characters in this narrative, but where she differs wildly from the others is, of course, her presentation. Wealhtheow and later Helak's wife, both embody the ideal feminine virtues in the patriarchal societies of medieval Europe, acting as welcoming figures to the home, performing ceremonial duties, and giving wise counsel to their husbands. Yet Grendel's mother is the antithesis of these very ideas, clashing with the views an aristocratic audience would hold dear, and in the historical context, painting her in an even worse light. We also see hints of Hrothgar's backsliding into idol worship, a repeat of events during Grendel's 12 years of terror, and calling back on the connection to the ancient Israelites I referenced in the beginning of this video. The steadfastness in Beowulf's declaration convinces Hrothgar that now is the time to act, and so his men mount up and together ride from Heorot, following the blood trail of Grendel to his lair in the marshlands, though come across the head of Aesir in the process, laid as a warning sign for any who wish to follow. The group arrives at a massive lake sitting above the lair, and swimming at the surface are numerous sea monsters, guarding against any who enter. A sight which horrifies the party as a Yiddish warrior kills one, dragging it to shore for others to marvel. Regardless of this, Beowulf readies himself for combat, donning a helmet with totemic boar images for protection, an expertly woven mail shirt, and the sword, Hrunting, lent by Unferth, forgetting the words once spoken, having accepted Beowulf as the better man. A speech is given by the eight prior to entering, reminding Hrothgar of his promise to love him as kin, requesting that if he falls, to be a lord to the eights he brought, send all the treasure he's won to his king Helak, and return Hrunting to Unferth. What should be noted here is the location of the lair itself, as lakes such as the one described were ever common in practices within North Germanic paganism, often linked with fertility goddesses such as Nerthus, practices that involved human sacrifice to ensure healthy births and bountiful harvests the following season. It's entirely possible that given this context, the author was associating these old pagan practices with Grendel's lair, envisioning it with a hell on earth approach, much like in the Old Testament, where for those unaware, the Hebrew word Gehenna is utilized as both the name of hell itself and a physical location where child sacrifices were performed. A vision further backed up when one considers the monster said to guard its entrance, translated by Tolkien as sea demons. Another aspect that may stand out to the modern reader is the heavy focus on the gear Beowulf is preparing. There is the obvious helmet with boar images for protection, likely linked to local pagan beliefs, and also the sword Hrunting, said to have never failed its wielder in a strike. But throughout this narrative, special focus is continuously placed on the mail shirts worn by our heroes, something that may seem odd if you don't understand how valuable these items were. Any well-made steel equipment was both incredibly rare and expensive in early medieval Europe, let alone a piece of armor that required significantly more material and time than any weapon. To put things in perspective, having a well-made mail coat was like having an armor of Mithril or Beskar in their respective universes, something which Beowulf will be truly grateful for in the battle to come. As our hero dives into the Forbidden Lake, he's swarmed by the sea demons it houses, restricting his movements but unable to break through the chainmail he bears. Grendel's mother, aware of the invader, takes hold of Beowulf, pulling him down into her lair, which acts as a miraculous air pocket below. It's in this hellish cave that the battle is waged, as Beowulf attempts to strike at the monster with Hrunting to no avail, before being brutally pinned by the mother, only saved when his mail coat deflects a deadly blow. Desperate for victory, Beowulf looks around the dark and damp cave, discovering a massive sword amongst the hordes of treasure forged by the giants of old. Too large for any normal man to wield, Beowulf uses his great strength to strike at Grendel's mother, killing her then and there. Having killed the mother, Beowulf goes looking for the son, finding Grendel lying dead in a corner of the cave, having succumbed to his injuries. He decapitates the monster with the Blade of Giants, causing it to melt like ice from the blood, and leaving nothing but the hilt. Collecting the head of Grendel and taking care not to lose the giant's hilt, Beowulf exits the cave, swimming to the surface. Now, whilst the battle raged between Beowulf and the mother of Grendel, the king and his men grew more and more desperate, and when the gore of the mother dirtied the lake, many left, mistakenly believing Beowulf slain. Yet his small Yiddish force held out hope, and eventually rejoiced to God when their lord came swimming from the depths, helping to carry the head of Grendel back to Heorot, requiring the strength of 4 men to do so. This battle is in many ways Beowulf's entrance into hell itself, fighting off demons which surround him and taking on a great beast within, with the giant sword serving as a connection to many Germanic legends of the time, in which a monster can only be killed by weapons of their kind. Furthermore, the fact that the sword would have been unwieldable to any barring Beowulf and his strength puts an Arthurian spin on the matter, with the final process of decapitating Grendel likely coming from a tradition of ensuring the death of the monster, similar to later legends involving werewolves or vampires. Hrothgar is overcome with joy, knowing now for sure that their fear is no longer necessary, and promises to reward Beowulf many times over for bringing peace to his people. Handed the giant's weapon, the king examines the images engraved on the hilt, explaining how the entirety of the giant's rise and fall, culminating in the biblical flood, is pictured in the piece. In response to all he's witnessed, Hrothgar understands that Beowulf will inevitably become king, not of the Danes, but the Yeats, and therefore warns him not to rule like Hermod, but reward those who do well by him, and strive for stability amongst his people, embracing Beowulf fully as he realizes he will likely not see him again in this lifetime, and ensuring his message is made clear by endowing the Eight with gifts only befit for a king. In response, Beowulf promises support for years to come, and offers to foster Hrothgar's son at the Yadish court, displaying that he will back the child if a succession crisis arises. As the Yeats return to their ship, they come across the same coast guard who offered to guard it in the epic's beginning, endowing him with a sword bound with gold, said to have made him worthier amongst his peers thereafter, and with that, set sail back to Yatland. This final interaction may actually be one of the most insightful of the entire epic, as the hilt of the ancient sword is said to have contained an entire telling of the biblical giants, or Nephilim, and their fall. However, that grand telling culminating in the flood is not present in the Bible, at least not in its entirety. Where that is found is in the book of Enoch. Considered non-canonical by most Christian and Jewish sects, it tells the story of a group known as the Watchers, and their interactions with humanity, displaying the unique relationship the Anglo-Saxons had with non-canonical scripture, and its influence on their culture. Furthermore, we witness Hrothgar and Beowulf's final meeting, during which he references Hermod, a figure previously mentioned as the embodiment of what a bad king could become. Yet we already see how Beowulf will be a better ruler than most, as he generously rewards the Coast Guardsmen for watching the ship, and offers to do the noble thing of backing Hrothgar's heir over vying for the Danish throne. However, what this interaction does is effectively place a level of tension on the return home, as we must now witness how King Helac reacts to his newly powerful nephew. As Beowulf sets foot back in Yatland, we are greeted with a brief description of Helac and his wife Hed, during which they are praised greatly as monarchs, especially the queen, calling back to my earlier statements on the manner in which the very few female characters are presented in this narrative. Upon questioning by his king, Beowulf delivers a grand speech, recounting the entirety of his tale and being careful to not leave out any details, while also giving counsel of the political situation, and warning Helac that he does not expect the peace to hold after Hrothgar's death, noting the tense relations with the nearby Jutes and Frisians. It's here he presents the wealth of items gifted by the Shieldings to his king, as it is he who ultimately holds the right to distribute such gifts, including a luxurious set of armor and sword, passed down from ruler to ruler of Denmark, but now given to Beowulf. It's this kingly gift which openly confirms the Yeats' newfound status. And how does Helac react? He promptly gifts the set back to the young man, elevating him in status to a minor subordinate and granting him numerous lands in the region, making it clear to the reader that Helac is a great king, fairly dishing out the treasure and rewarding those who deserve it, as it should be noted that the Shieldings are at this point an incredibly powerful dynasty, and Beowulf has now gained their king's favor for years to come. This conclusion marks the end of the first section of Beowulf, telling the tale of how a young Yiddish warrior gained prominence amongst his people with the slaying of great monsters. I hope now that you have at least a partial picture of the epic, you can understand how this narrative was so frustrating to academics who utilized it as a solely historical document, as it focuses heavily on fantastical elements entirely separate from the historical record, while suffering as a narrative from the same problem of many ancient texts, in which, due to the intended audience, the author assumes the reader already familiar with other tales of the time. Something quite ironic today, as for references such as King Hermod, Beowulf is our only historical source. In spite of this, the text still stands as one of the most influential in English literature, with its lasting impact becoming more apparent as we dive into the second, though much shorter, half of the poem. It's also here where my recounting will differ ever so slightly from the text itself, as the first section here is all over the place in terms of its chronology. And given this video's purpose is to understand the narrative itself, I at least hope I'm afforded some grace on the matter. We learn that after a period of peace following the death of Grendel, Beowulf assisted Helac in a failed raid of Frisia, modern-day Netherlands, during which the king fell, with Beowulf only surviving by swimming to Jutland, carrying 30 chainmail coats in his arms, presumably from 30 men he'd slain, to avenge his uncle. Upon his return, the throne of Jutland was actually offered to him, but much like in Denmark, he picked the more noble path, opting to support Helac's son and act as a close advisor. It's only after said son, Heardred, is killed for an involvement in a feud of the Swedish royal family, does Beowulf take the throne, promptly avenging the death and ruling uncontested for 50 years. This information creates an immediate contrast between the Yates and the Shieldings. As though the latter is far more powerful, the former is able to peacefully transition power due to the nobility of Beowulf, in direct contrast to the brother of Hrothgar, who was hinted to have involvement with the crisis in Denmark. Furthermore, it establishes the need for a strong ruler in Jutland, as Beowulf, much like Hrothgar, ensures peace through strength, dissuading the Frisians or Swedes from retaliating. It's after this 50 years of rule, however, a new danger begins to brew, as deep within Jutland, a barrow was disturbed, one which lay silent for 300 years after the last member of a now extinct people laid his race's treasure within. Yet in the poem's time, a slave, scorned by his master, discovered a secret entrance to the barrow and grasped a great golden cup, hoping to regain favor. Though upon returning with his master in tow, the two alerted the hoard's guardian, a dragon, who after discovering he'd been robbed, sets out on a nocturnal raid to destroy whatever's in his path, burning most of the countryside, including Beowulf's hall, to the ground. The now Yiddish king, realizing what's at stake, remembers the exploits of his youth and gears up for war. This single event, though only a couple pages in explanation, is likely the most recognizable in its influence, as almost the entire process was lifted and utilized in The Hobbit. Whether we look at the ancient treasure, the secret entrance, or the very item stolen, the foundational elements are all here. However, where this narrative differs is the Drake itself, as Tom Shippey, in his phenomenal translation and commentary, points out that considering the numerous Germanic traditions of the time, it's likely that the final survivor actually became the dragon to guard his people's hoard, a tradition likely cut by the author due to its apparent pagan influence, though something C.S. Lewis would later utilize in the Chronicles of Narnia, where in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, the character of Eustace becomes a dragon after falling asleep amongst an ancient hoard. Returning to the narrative itself, what makes this situation different from Beowulf's previous is that he is now significantly older, likely close to 70 years old in my estimation, yet as we'll see, opts to fight the dragon alone, ordering his small group of retainers to stay back near the tree line as he approaches the barrow and calls the drake to combat. The two engage in a desperate battle, and though this time Beowulf is actually armed with sword and shield, it becomes very quickly apparent that he is outmatched in his foe. In response, his men begin to flee out of fear. That is, except for Wiglaf, a Swedish nobleman and nephew of the king. As the young Swede enters battle to assist his kin, he's able to draw attention away from Beowulf, granting opportunity for the Geat to land a hard blow on the drake itself, only for his sword to break in the process, failing its wielder due to his still massive strength. Shortly thereafter, the dragon bites Beowulf, sinking its teeth in an exposed area of his neck. It's described that as lifeblood came pouring out, Wiglaf thrust his sword into the dragon's abdomen, burning his hand in the process, but buying enough time for Beowulf to draw a sax from his coat and deliver a fatal blow. Yet as the two lay exhausted, the king's wound begins to swell, and Beowulf realizes he's been poisoned with only minutes left to live. In his final moments, he asks Wiglaf to collect some treasure from the hoard, so he can lay his eyes on the wealth he won for his people, and after doing so, orders the construction of a great barrow in his honor, while questioning if he's done enough good in his life to gain paradise. His final act is to pass his gear onto Wiglaf, naming his successor in the process before departing in the narrator's words, to seek the judgments of the righteous. And so marks the end of Beowulf, who we can see from the text grew overconfident in his abilities, yet died nobly defending his people. His final question regarding the fate of his soul was quite heavy for the time, as this was written in a period of many new conversions to Christianity, in a society that deeply valued their ancestry, leading to that very question occurring again and again. The people of Geatland are left distraught, as Wiglaf orders the construction of a funeral pyre and the recovery of the gold, only to discover that a curse was placed upon it so that no man may touch it without the consent of God himself, leaving the death of Beowulf, though avenged by himself, ultimately in vain. Wiglaf here gives a somber speech, predicting great troubles for the Geats with the death of their king, as now the Swedes, Franks, and Frisians have no deterrence against retaliation, and will soon bring their land to ruin. A foreboding sense of complete annihilation is present in the text, something quite powerful when one takes a look at a modern map. We finish with a final remark. Thus bemourned the Geatish folk their master's fall, comrades of his hearth, crying that he was ever of the kings of earth of men most generous, and to men most gracious, to his people most tender, and for praise most eager. And thus concludes the poem of Beowulf, ending on the somber note of destruction after recounting the tale of the great Geatish king, his magnanimous rise and tragic fall. The epic stands as one of the most influential in English literature, and if this video was at all interesting, I greatly encourage you to pick up a copy for yourself, as this poem is full of material to sink your teeth in, with every single bit of commentary having entire libraries written on it. If you're curious as to where to start, I highly recommend the translation and commentary by Tom Shippey, an academic who has spent over 50 years studying the poem, and taught at universities from Oxford to Harvard. Though I read 3 translations, 2 commentaries, and dug through numerous other essays, documentaries, and discussions, this book probably gave me about 60 to 70% or more of the knowledge shared in this video, as it's just absolutely packed with insights and incredibly easy to understand. A full bibliography can be found in the description below, and let me know what I should cover next, as I had an absolute blast picking this narrative apart, and would love to make a series out of it with other pieces of literature. As always, I'll see you all next time, and of course, thank you for watching.